my comparative government class who is here in attendance, and I also have my online international relations students who are supposed to be watching as well. So hello to all of you. I'm making this this video, to try to accomplish a few different things. First of all, for my international relations students who are covering Chapter 1 this week, I wanted to try to introduce some of the key concepts that I think are important for you to understand. And for comparative government students, I wanted to try to explain how the changing international structure is impacting various states around the world, and how there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between the two. So I've got about 20 slides. I apologize for that. And I think the best way of doing this, if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask them. But I've also passed out some index cards so you could have any questions or comments that you think of along the way. If you want to ask those at the end, we can do that too. So to start off with, most international relations textbooks kind of start out by talking about how international relations relates to you. And there's so many different ways, and I'm sure that you've thought of this before, but this is kind of the idea of like what happens outside the borders of any one individual country. And I'm just going to say that, country we refer to typically in international relations and comparative government as states. So what happens outside the borders of your state and how it could impact what happens. And clearly, conflicts, wars, there's so many that are happening around the world, and we'll talk about some of those, but how they may disrupt the global supply chain, things like gas prices, food prices, and things like that that might get disrupted because of conflicts that are happening around the world. And of course, just your own personal interest of friends or family members or your fellow human beings who are being killed and being in harm's way because of these global crises. And there's so many other issues. Just to highlight a couple, I would argue that one of the major transnational issues in the world today is migration. We're just seeing huge waves, millions of people who are moving from their native lands to other lands for safety reasons, for economic reasons, and for climate reasons. And obviously that has created a backlash in many of the states that these migrants are moving to. And then of course trade. And later in this semester, I believe March 25th, we're going to have an event in this same time period looking at global trade and tariffs and the way that that can impact the economy in various states. But as many of you know as consumers, what you buy is rarely just made in one individual state. Things like an iPhone or MacBook that you're using today are assembled in various parts of the world. And so it's, again, those global supply chains matter. So these are just a handful of different ways of what happens outside the borders of the United States, how it might impact you. In international relations, we use the term security a lot. And the textbook that I use for my international relations talks about 3 different domains. It has a much broader view of security than typically is used. I think this top one, international security, kind of military conflict, is one that's probably used the most. But there's human security too. Sustainability in the environment, the quality of life of individuals, and then of course, another form of security is your economic security. I think globally, this was a big issue in many of the elections around the world this year. Inflation, high prices is something that we'll talk about, how that was a major reason why people voted the way they did in 2024 election, not only in the United States, but globally, where we saw numerous incumbent parties suffer at the polls because of higher prices. Okay, so a few different challenges in IR. This term is one that I think many of my international relations students struggle with just a little bit, and that is this concept of anarchy. We use it in international relations. We don't mean chaos like it typically you would find in a definition in a dictionary. It means that there's no global power. There is no world government that can compel individual states on what to do. Now, there's different ways. There is a United Nations, we'll get to that, and there's members, 193 member states of the United Nations, but the United Nations can't force individual states to change their actions at the state level. So generally what that means is that states kind of have to take security into their own hands. And we'll talk about some of the consequences of that. Another theme in challenges in IR, just the diversity that we have of the actors in international relations in 2025. Thinking about all the different, so I mentioned 193 states. There's also a lot of non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations. So IGOs would be things like the United Nations. They could be trade deals, some sort of pacts between states. And then, really wealthy individuals. I'm thinking of somebody like an Elon Musk, or not just entrepreneurs, but they could be people who do humanitarian assistance. So there's just a whole bunch of different actors, and that the first two kind of result in the last one, and that is a very complex international environment where you have not just state actors, but non-state actors. And so it's a very diverse and complex field in international relations. Another misunderstood concept in international relations is the levels of analysis. And these are basically who are the players, who are the key actors in international relations, and different ways of conceptualizing this. One way of conceptualizing this, like an old school camera, where you can kind of zoom in and zoom out, and as you zoom out, you get a much wider lens and picture, and as you zoom in, obviously it gets more focused. And so three levels of analysis that I'm going to talk about today that is typically used in IR. Sometimes we use 5. I'm going to talk about 3. So individual, like one person matters. It matters that we have, yesterday was Inauguration Day in the United States. It matters that, President Trump is in power versus Biden. And maybe you could explain some sort of international event through that lens. We'll talk, or it doesn't just have to be an elected official. It could just be, again, an entrepreneur, some sort of, humanitarian, somebody who, like Bill Gates, who's donating billions of dollars to try to alleviate some global poverty or some sort of other issue. But a specific person matters. And sometimes I think we get bogged down too much in this. You're like, oh, it matters that Putin is the president of Russia, and if it wasn't for Putin, then this wouldn't have happened in Ukraine or something like that. And I'll explain maybe more about that, of why I think this is probably overused sometimes in trying to understand global events. The other way of looking at it is states as like puzzle pieces, where like a puzzle piece, everything inside the borders of that puzzle piece matters. Typically, we measure this as power, like military power, economic power. It could be the geography or terrain of that individual state. And then the last, and the one that I'll spend the most time on today, is the most confusing, I think, of the 3 levels of analysis, and that is the international or system level of analysis. And so typically with this, what we're trying to do is measure how many powers are there in the world? How many major powers are there? In different times in world history, it has varied. And then the other thing I want to add to this is it's not always, there's sometimes disagreement amongst international relations scholars of how many world powers there are at any given point in time. But typically, when we use this framework of a system level of analysis, we're talking about how many world powers there are. And there's basically 3 forms of a system. One is where there's one major superpower, and we would call that a unipolar system. There's one major pole. Again, there's some debate in this, and I want to talk about some of that debate. But arguably, the time period in world history when we've had this unipolar system would be kind of post 1991, downfall of the Soviet Union. And then when that ends, again, is up to some debate. But arguably, maybe sometime in 2008, 10, 12, somewhere along those lines. There are some international relations scholars who contend that we still have a unipolar system with the United States at the top. But as I'll show you, I think the consensus is that we've moved away from this unipolar system. The other system of the three is a two-power system. Arguably, this was a system that we had post-World War II to arguably 1991 or 1989, somewhere along those lines, where it was the Soviet Union and the United States as the two global superpowers. The third system is when there's more than two powers. Sometimes there's an ascending power, there's declining powers. It's a little bit ambiguous of, again, how many powers there might be or how powerful they may be. I think we might be in one of those moments today. Arguably, we were in one of these moments too, pre-World War I, maybe even up to World War II. Various world powers kind of jockeying for position. Many international relations textbooks have contended that these multipolar systems are the most dangerous. And one takeaway I want to make sure that everybody's clear, a disclaimer. I'm not trying to argue that any one of these systems has been benevolent and hasn't led to bad things happening throughout the world, where there's been many people killed in conflicts, or that there's been kind of an imperialist or greedy situation of a world power, just saying, for many people have said that the bipolar system was one of the more stable systems, in part because the Soviet Union and the United States never directly went to war against one another. They had nuclear weapons, but as we know, from 1945 to 1989, it wasn't like there was just global peace, and those two major superpowers weren't involved in coups or proxy wars and all those types of other things. So again, I don't want to try to sanitize any one of these systems, but generally speaking, the consensus is that it's a little bit more dangerous in a multipolar system, and that World War I to World War II era kind of, I think, borne that out. Just pause for a minute. Questions that anybody may have so far? We will have questions and comments at the end, but feel free to write those down along the way. But if there's something I can get to that's kind of urgent in your mind now, Ashwin?
I guess I was going to make that. I was going to ask why, I guess, would multipolar systems be seen as safer? Because, I mean, or more dangerous. Sorry.
More dangerous.
Because initially in my mind, it seems like it would be, I guess, more even and, like, the world power and, not having one dominating country sounds...
Yeah, having one dominant. So the question is, why is that multipolar system, the ideal or safest in the world? Another disclaimer here is that this is political science class, political science. We are trying to be a science, but it's not like physics and some other hard sciences where we have thousands and thousands of that we don't have data sets that have thousands of examples. We only have, like, we're really kind of talking about a world system maybe a couple hundred years old, and so we don't have real life experiments where we can alter the system and kind of see the direct impact that it's going to have, right? So there's theories that I think help us, but so to why that world system with multiple competing powers is more dangerous, generally declining powers might try to take action to try to arrest that decline, seizing lands, being more aggressive. Sometimes it creates a system where states around the world might think, well, it's kind of like, I hate to use a phrase this way, but cat's away, the mice will play type of deal where, there isn't any major superpower to try to intervene that has the capacity to do so. So I don't know, I'm Bashar al-Assad and I can use violence, including chemical weapons against my own people, and it doesn't appear that there's going to be any real consequences for that. That's the argument, that there's states that are competing to be that next global superpower, potentially world power, and they're trying to take actions to get themselves to the top. And those that are declining are trying to take actions to keep them from going. Nobody likes going from here to here. And that's a simple version off the top. Okay. So the other thing, so in the post-World War II era, this global system that it was a bipolar system, generally speaking, but there's also another kind of way that it was referred to as a global system, and that is this liberal world order. And I've heard some jokes about this, that doesn't play well in many parts of the United States or parts of the world. People don't like the idea of liberal, they don't like the idea of world, they don't like the idea of order, so you put those three together and it creates a backlash. Other people have referred to this era as like kind of Pax Americana, in that there's kind of peace, global peace and prosperity kind of led by the United States at the top of this global order. So let me try to explain some of the institutions and mechanisms that helped characterize this era from maybe 1945 to more recently. First of all, global institutions. After World War II, there was many institutions that were created. The Bretton Woods system is one of them. If you've heard this, several world leaders met in Bretton Woods and created multiple institutions. So we have, I think I have them up here, yeah. Not the United Nations right away, but ultimately a few years later, the United Nations, this first global entity that had been in the works for actually decades, but initially had been thought of as a League of Nations, but this kind of global body that was going to be made up of member states as a way to try to, just gone through 2 major world wars, over 100 million people killed, right? How could they have created a system to try to prevent another global war from happening? The International Monetary Fund, World Bank, I think it was originally the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, ultimately became the World Trade Organization, and then later institutions like global collective security agreements with Western allied states, with NATO, later various states like France, England, and Germany working together on things like steel production, and then ultimately more and more cooperation leading to currency agreements with the creation of the euro. So those are some of the institutions. Another key principle of this era of the liberal world order is trying to promote more free trade and freer markets, reducing tariffs. There's kind of an argument that leading into World War I and World War II, that each state raising tariffs and trying to increase the price of goods from other states coming into their own, led to trade wars, and trade wars could lead to fighting wars with military. And a promotion of democracy, and again, one could spend an entire time period critiquing that there was some not so democratic movements going on here, including by the United States. But you did see a bit, we have different international organizations that assess individual states of how democratic they are. And there was kind of an explosion of democracies after World War II. In the 1940s and 50s, in the 1970s, ultimately up till about 2009-ish. We'll talk about that. But the idea is 2 democracies generally don't go to war with one another, and so if you have more and more democratic systems around the world, it's going to be a safer world. Promotion of human rights. I can't keep doing my disclaimers, but again, there's clearly some flaws with this, but the idea of like protecting humans around the world, making sure that they're not being targeted based on their identity. And then collective security. This is, I referred to NATO earlier, this idea that attack against one is an attack against all, and that adversaries would take that into consideration, knowing that if you invaded this country, if you fought this country, that there was going to be a retaliation by multiple other states. A couple of other things I just wanted to say about this. This is going to be a quote from an article from about 7 years ago. But I'm picking this. This was an article in the New York Times by Paul Krugman. But the reason I selected this quote is Kagan is an international scholar. He was quoted in here. And basically what this quote's trying to say is like, this liberal world order wasn't designed just for benevolent reasons. It was designed to help make the United States and some of the other Western powers more economically prosperous. But in bringing former adversaries like Germany and Japan into the Western world and being democratic and having open markets was, if you lived in the continent of Europe in the 1900s, it was a very, very bloody time period. And so to imagine relative peace and prosperity and trading between some of these historical rivals is a pretty big development that I don't think should be overlooked. So the idea was to try to create a new system from what preceded the 1945 era. Now, what I'm showing you here, and I wouldn't mind actually just showing, so first of all, a little bit of background to this. When we're talking about polarity of how many major poles there are in any one system, it gets a little complicated, it gets subjective. Generally speaking, we're looking at military hard power, we're looking at GDP, the economy of various states, and so there is some objective measurements, but like when one becomes a superpower, you know, there's some soft power, like how you can compel other states to do what you'd like them to do without using tariffs or using military hard power. So with, again, those kind of disclaimers in mind, a year and a half ago, Foreign Affairs surveyed 68 international relations scholars and asked them about the global system and like what was the most accurate current distribution of power. This was in May of 2023. And I just want you to, so the global distribution of power is closest to a unipolar system. So they're basically saying the current system is a unipolar system. Do you agree, disagree, or strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree? I put these are the results. So a couple of things, a couple of ways you could analyze this. One, there's some disagreement. It is not a consensus, 100%, where all international relations scholars are saying definitively we are or are not in a unipolar system, right? So the other way that you could analyze this is even though there's some debate, there is a pretty strong consensus that no, we are no longer in a unipolar moment. And this is kind of a, 63% would say no, and help me with the math, is 24% would say yes. So it's, over twice as many who say that we are no longer in a unipolar system. And I just want to pull this up for a moment so you can see it. This website for my comparative international relations students will look more at this in detail. But the cool thing about it is you can see they map this down of the spectrum of whether you agree or disagree. And a little confusing, but each of these numbers, so on the strongly degree, there were 7 different people that put it in that scale. So that's why each of those numbers represents the number of international relations scholars who had that specific point. And then you could, if you scroll down, you could look at these different international relations scholars and you could click on, either click on somebody who I follow more closely, is pick on Barry Posen for a minute. Polarity seems like an easy thing to measure because it's meant to rely on objective measure like the distribution of capabilities. Material power seems like it should be easy to measure, but that turns out to not be the case. Scholars, statespeople, in intelligence analysis often disagree on what to count. So again, I just want to show you that they're trying to say that there's some subjectivity here. It's not always so easy to assess. But that being said, that this person, the scholar says that there's 6 powers that tend to treat one another as quite important, and that's the United States, China, Russia, India, France, and the United Kingdom. All right. So I could spend an entire talk on this part of trying to come up with compelling reasons of why we're no longer in a unipolar system. I think one reason it's clear, though, is just the rise of China, and especially with the rise of China's economy and their trade surplus. It reached a record, and since we've been keeping track of this, $1 trillion in 2024. China has invested in infrastructure projects all over the globe. This Belt and Road Initiative, places in Latin America, places in Africa, places in Asia, really, and their soft power has increased. Trump yesterday in his talk, in inauguration, mentioned the Panama Canal. China has been involved in infrastructure projects there. So again, there's a bunch of different examples that one could use. I just wanted to show you purchasing power parity is one example of taking GDP basically into cost of living. And in this regard, China's actually at the top with $31 trillion GDP, purchasing power parity, $7 trillion higher than the United States. This is the bullet points I have here next are from Yuval Noah Harari, who in a YouTube video that's titled The Return of Wars, and I think this is interesting to think about, of like when maybe this unipolar moment ended for the United States, and he's talking about a few different factors, and he's not the only one to have done this, but basically the United States is an exhausted superpower. In part, the United States had a war in Afghanistan, started in 2001. And then two years later, another war in Iraq. These were decades-long, 2-decade-long wars. Trillions of dollars of costs also kind of resulted in the United States being less supportive of using military abroad. One could argue that Obama recognized this, in the example I was given earlier with Syria. Essentially, Obama had talked about there being a red line if Syria had ever used chemical weapons, and then Syria uses chemical weapons, and there's essentially no red line. That could be one example of how the United States, of why the United States kind of declined as a global superpower. The financial crisis, 2008, 2009, huge unemployment, stimulus programs, debt and deficits increased significantly. Another thing that to recognize, in the last 15 years in particular, is that there's just been a whole range of transnational issues that have exploded on the world stage. Climate change in particular led to a lot of disruption, movement of people globally, a rise of technology that has replaced workers, manufacturer workers, textile workers, led to various states like China gaining an advantage globally, especially in artificial intelligence. So why does this matter? This, again, is kind of getting at to the global system and multipolar system of why it might be a problem. And this is a quote from Charles Kupchan from The Atlantic this year, just a couple weeks ago, actually, titled, "Trump is right that Pax Americana is over." This quote, I'm just going to read it in case you can't hear it see it online. "Unilateralism won't work in today's world. No nation can opt out of a globe that has grown irreversibly interdependent. Countering aggression, managing international commerce, arresting global warming, preventing nuclear proliferation, regulating the development and deployment of artificial intelligence. These are only a few of the challenges that necessitate international teamwork." And I fundamentally agree with that, and the part in particular that, just to name a few, like there is just a bunch of global challenges that these 193 sovereign states cannot individually fix on their own. It is going to require global cooperation. This is from a group called the Eurasia Group. They have listed every year the top risks facing the world. And this year, their number one risk is basically a G0 world. That's kind of a play off of there's G7, like the 7 most advanced industrialized democracies in the world, and they're the biggest economies. They work together to solve global issues. Their argument here is that there's like a G0 world. There is no global leadership. There's a power vacuum, if you will. So this direct quote is like, we're heading back to the law of the jungle, a world where the strongest can do what they can, while the weakest are condemned to suffer what they must. And the former, whether states, companies, or individuals, can't be trusted to act in the interests of those they have power over. A couple weeks ago, Fareed Zakaria, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he has the Global Public Square on CNN. This is a really fascinating 1-hour special he did on America First, this kind of rise of nationalism in the United States and retreat from being more involved globally. And just a few takeaways that he cited. Steven Pinker, if you're not familiar with him, in 2012, did a bunch of research saying that it's the best time to be alive. We are more likely to die from self-harm, suicide, overeating, than from war. And that was a pretty unique takeaway from hundreds of years of data that showed that you're most likely to die from other human beings in another state trying to kill you. The huge advantages, like huge economic growth, especially in the last 75 years. Tariffs went from being about 20% of the global economy to only 5% in that time period from 1945 to 2016. There was only $64 billion of trade around 1950 to $25 trillion in 2022. This is a link I just wanted to show you of like the change of global economies throughout the world. So the biggest economies, and this is going to be tough to see. See if I can make this a little smaller. Yeah. I will share that link in a different way. Basically, it's trying to show how the economies, if you look on the far left side, the United States in the 1960s, all these economies were really pretty small, comparatively speaking, to where they are today. And of course, some states like Soviet Union, no longer a state, but how China, especially from 1990 to 2024, has gained dramatically. And this really can't be overstated. I know China is a punching bag domestically in the United States, but the hundreds of millions of people who went from poverty to non-poverty to having better economic prospects was a really radical development in world politics. So the number of people who are living in poverty globally has declined, and the rise of India and China is a big reason for that. So here, I was making a claim earlier at the beginning of this talk about the kind of reciprocal relationship between what happens at the global system within states. There's like a feedback loop here, and I can't exactly tease out the exact cause and effect here, but we know that there's a rise of populism, this kind of idea of like drawbridge up that we want to, and not just when I say we, this isn't just in the United States, but whether it's in the United Kingdom, we're seeing this trend globally where there seems to be anti-immigration public mood and less support for being involved in global institutions, working together with allies, and then putting your country first. Obviously, there's an America First Here movement led by Donald Trump, not just in 2024, but going back to really throughout his life, but when he came to political life in 2015, 2016, this was really what separated himself from the dozen and a half competitors that he competed against in 2016 Republican nomination. And we see this with many other states, right? They're putting their state first. And so the concern here is if everybody's putting their state first, how do you work together to solve global problems that really impact your individual state? And again, that's more of a question. We'll get to that in a minute. A couple of arguments I want to make. This is just trying to show that, again, there's never been a perfectly peaceful world where people are not being killed, taken advantage of, and so forth. The first link I'm going to show you is Uppsala Conflict Data Program. I'm just going to back out for a minute. I think I have these in order. This shows data from 1946 to 2023. Each of these different colors is representing essentially different regions of the world. And you can see on the left-hand axis here, we have the number of state-based conflicts. And then at the bottom here, we have the years. And clearly you can see an upward swing of the number of state-based conflicts is at its highest in the last few years during this roughly 80-year time period. Next link I'm going to show you is from the same organization. This one is looking at fatalities in state-based conflicts by regions. And again, you see a major spike. 2011 starting to go up. This is when we roughly might kind of target when the global system really evolved, but definitely spiked in the last few years. This is non-state conflicts involving organized crime groups compared to other formerly recognized time groups. So this goes back from 1989. And the red line is organized crime groups. Notice how 1989 all the way maybe up to maybe 2006, pretty low in the number of fatalities. And then, 2008, 2009, going up, and then really taking off after 2016. This is from a different organization. This is from ACLED. And 1 in 8 people are estimated to have been exposed to conflict so far in 2024. There's 50 countries that rank high in the index for extreme high turbulent levels of conflict. And 25% increase in political violence deaths recorded in the last 12-month period. And I'll make this just a little bit bigger. And this is showing people who are most likely to be exposed to civilian deaths. And as you may not be surprised, Palestine is on this far right end, and Myanmar, Syria, Mexico, Nigeria. And then one last, this is from the New York Times, going back from 1995, fatalities from armed conflict. They are going to list a few various conflict zones: Syria, Ethiopia, Ukraine, here in black, Israel, Gaza, West Bank, starting 2023, 2024. And then you can see just, again, the scale, the number of people being killed has more than doubled in this time period being looked at. Okay. This next handful of slides I want to show before we end here and get to questions and comments is a really recent article from the Washington Post, Adam Taylor, title, Data Shows Conflict Surged in 2024. Very unsettling pictures. Very few regions saw a decline in conflict. Of course, Europe and Middle East saw the biggest escalations. But the reason I picked this one is there's 56 active conflicts taking place at the time of 2024, which was the most since the end of World War II. And the ACLED site, I just showed you that the number of people, 1 in 8, living in a conflict zone within 3 miles, with 81% of the Palestinian population who is exposed to conflict. The number of people who have been killed in conflicts has grown by 30% from the preceding year, and they were projecting that 2025 was going to be worse than 2024, which again was a record year that we've had for many decades. And then this is a quote from international relations scholar Paul Post, who's actually at the University of Chicago. The ongoing breakdown in global order and rising multipolarity, a world system in which more widely distributed with global bodies such as the United Nations Security Council paralyzed, have led to major powers asserting their regional influence and undermining one another. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described the state of affairs as a purgatory of polarity in an address to the General Assembly in September. And yeah, they're predicting, ACLED is predicting a 20% increase in conflict in 2025. They have particular concerns about Colombia, Mexico, several parts of Africa, in the Middle East, and real concern about China potentially invading Taiwan couldn't be ruled out. And so I just wanted to, this isn't meant to be comprehensive, but I just wanted to show you to end. Right on time, I wanted to spend about 45 minutes in giving information, and the last 30 minutes, questions and comments, is all of, not a comprehensive list, but just some of the hot spots, things to be thinking about in 2025. So trade wars, I mentioned a little bit earlier, retaliation, is one example. If the United States puts a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, Canada and Mexico is going to retaliate with their own tariffs. Consumers are going to be paying higher costs of goods and services, and so just the way that could keep tit for tat escalating up. Middle East has seen a lot of changes. Obviously, there's been some positive developments. Ceasefire essentially between in Gaza in Israel, but certainly a very precarious, call it peace right now that could erode. I think one thing to keep your eye on is in the West Bank in particular, but also major developments in places like Syria. Assad has fled. Some of the foreign involvement, like Russia and Iran, has declined, and so this could lead to a couple different directions for Syria, which will have consequences on the region. But I definitely see a decline in global cooperation and institutions. One of the things that Trump said yesterday was that the United States was going to leave the World Health Organization, which was established in 1948. I think that could be a sign of things to come, is kind of, withdrawing from the Paris Paris Climate Accord. Sorry. Just those two examples. Like if the United States starts leaving global agreements, other states could do the same. Is there a power vacuum, lack of leadership? China and Taiwan. One of the things that I think could happen going 2025 in the future is just kind of spheres of influence, like we had maybe in the 1800s, early 1900s, where major powers like China kind of assert themselves in their region. Russia does the same in their region, and the United States does so in their regions. You hear these comments about the Panama Canal Zone or Greenland, and just kind of wonder if each of these major powers is going to be able to maybe be more assertive within regions of the globe. Yeah, I've spoken for more than enough time, so I'll just leave it there. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the idea here is if you have those index cards, if you prefer to ask a question or comment with the index cards anonymously, you're free to do so. If you prefer to raise your hand and ask a question that way, that's fine too. So I'll take any questions, comments, reactions, kind of maybe implications that you think that this might have on international relations, on individual states. Yeah, Josh. Yeah.
What are the arguments for the unipolar system? Why do some scholars think that we have a unipolar system? It seems like, America's been waning for years now. We seem to be on a similar level with other states. So I don't understand why it's still seen that America's top.
Yeah. I could show you those individual, as a class, we'll look at that, of the individual arguments that some of those scholars make on that side. A couple of things. I think it's military. So the question, just for those of you who may not have heard it, is what are some of the arguments of why the United States, why the world system could still be characterized as a unipolar system? One of the key domains is military. If you look around the world, in terms of the number of military bases, there's really no comparison. The United States has hundreds of military bases around the world. We don't see that same thing for China, right? Or Russia. Russia's more of a regional actor, very much a menacing one in Europe, but not establishing military bases, around the United States. Aircraft carriers is another way of projecting power globally. And China has one, I believe, maybe two. The United States has a couple dozen, right? Nuclear power, there's several states that do have nuclear power, so there's some parity there. The technological sophistication of the United States military, special forces, I would go on record of saying that I see a multipolar system, but in terms of some of the arguments that usually the military domain's the one that's going to, the U.S. currency, the dollar being the most used global currency, financial institute, if you look at like the biggest companies globally, the 500 biggest companies in the United States, we're 5% of the world's population. We have more than 5% of the most profitable or biggest revenue generating companies in the world. Those would be a couple of the arguments that come to mind. Good question. Others that you may have, or if you fast forward those index cards, be happy to take those too. Yeah, Matt.
Is there a possibility, would you say, that there could be yet another hegemonic power on the level of the United States at some point?
Okay, so the question of
Somewhere on that level.
somewhere on the level of the United States being kind of a global hegemon, that the United States was from sometime after World War II, maybe at its apex, like let's say late 1990s, pre 9/11, or maybe even up to 2001. A lot of disclaimers that I've made already is, again, this is really, you're out on a limb here, right? We're making a lot of guesses. There's some guesswork here. It's hard to imagine that, and when you ask that question, is it a state other than the United States, or could the United States regain itself as that global superpower?
Could there ever be a different state? For instance, could that be China?
Could that be China?
Could that be China, for instance? Could China ever be on that same level as the United States is?
I think it's unlikely that China would be in that same level of global superpower that the United States was. Some of the arguments that one could make, just playing the devil's advocate, is when you see like where China was in 1970 or even 1990 to where they are in 2025, that level of growth is exponential. And if they were to continue, like they're one of the few places in the world where it's like compounding 8% to 10% growth every single, they've grown about 4 times faster on average than the United States economy has in that like 1990 to 2024 time period. And so if that were to continue, and again, their technological sophistication, I had some stats written down, but like the number, like they lead the world in electric cars and solar batteries, or solar panels and electric batteries, and so many other, artificial intelligence. So there's some arguments there. They have a long ways to go militarily. And then back to that, multipolar, as they continue to rise, wouldn't one of the other major superpowers or world powers like the United States challenge that? Would they allow that upward development to continue without getting involved? It's hard to imagine that they wouldn't be confronted in some way, challenged.
So I would say to even out-innovate the other? Just concept back to back to back to back.
Well, for our class, we're going to look at a video from PBS Frontline with China, and in some ways we might be in a Cold War, emerging Cold War with the United States might be an emerging Cold War with China. So the question about could there be a new Cold War? And one of the ways that I think that the United States has declined with the unipolar system is in part you've seen an increase of other states who are unhappy that the United States had that perch and with the way that they handled themselves. In places like, the Iraq War is one example where there was not a United Nations Security Council resolution, and maybe, for lack of a better term, getting too big for their britches, getting too involved, being too dominant as a world power, and talking down to other states, especially, again, 5% of the world's population, not always acting as benevolent towards other states. So it isn't just one of the things about China is that their ability to attract partners, even if it's on an ad hoc basis on certain issues, but I'm thinking of places like Brazil and India and Russia, Iran. And so when you get a constellation of these states working together to challenge the United States in certain regards, that too kind of reminds me of the Cold War era where you've got these kind of aligned states. So in some ways, the Panama Canal Zone that Trump had talked about could be one of those examples of there being conflict between those two major states that reminds me of some parallels of the Cold War. It's a great question. And again, partly full humility here. I don't have all the answers. I don't think any of these international relations scholars are very great at predicting the future either. So partly I designed this event as a way for us to just kind of hypothesize ourselves, explore potential scenarios, and being humble enough to know that the way that this unfolds is really difficult to predict. But I appreciate those are some thoughtful mental exercises, if you will. Other questions? Yeah.
Why do we say the United States was at the top?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Oh, why do we say that the United States was at the top?
Why do we say that they were at the top?
Yeah.
Well, really, the Iraq War as being one example where you can essentially invade and topple, remove from power a world leader who was elected, albeit some undemocratic elections that were in Iraq, but to have regime change in thousands of miles away, and at least the initial phase being over within a few months is there's not too many examples of that in world history, right? Where some world power can just go on the other part of the globe, remove one of the biggest, at that time, Iraqi army. It was one of the top 10 armies in the world, and do so in a relatively quick amount of time is just one example, I would say, of many of the United States being able to project its power globally and really without challenge. I mean, there wasn't China, Russia saying, there was criticisms of this, but there wasn't like a direct confrontation where like, if you invade Iraq, there's gonna be, we're gonna attack you. So basically being able to act without impunity, if you will. Economically, after World War II, the United States was almost half the world's GDP, and huge export market, and just unrivaled in a lot of different areas. If you look at like top 100 universities in the world, the United States having way more than any of other state in the world, technological advancements, top 500, if you look at the top 500 companies in the world, the number of them that are based in the United States. So there's just a lot of different ways that you could, and then soft power, being able to compel other states, attract other states. One could look at cultural power of like Hollywood or music, fashion, and the way that the United States is a leader there. I remember one of the first times I went abroad and stayed in an Airbnb, and I believe this was in, well, a couple different places, but like in Finland, and you're going, people on the wall, they've got, you know, Pulp Fiction poster on their wall, and, you know, Elvis, you know, poster, and it's like U.S. culture is permeating so many other parts of the world. I mean, that's just, I could go on. Did you disagree that they were, or just?
Wondering what you meant by that.
What I meant by that, yeah, those are some of the different ways that you could conceptualize.
So, like, what caused it to kind of topple down?
So what caused it to topple down, I think, is also one of those things that we could get 10 international relations scholars in here and they'd maybe come up with some different ones. But I do think maybe some areas of agreement were those two separate, 2-decade-long wars, right? That ultimately led to $5 trillion or more in costs for the United States. Significant number of the same number of troops who were deployed over and over and over again. The families of those people, the communities just feeling very burnt out with bearing the costs, like the human costs of like having mom or dad away again, or losing people coming back and having PTSD, you know, alcohol, drug abuse, suicides. And I think, you know, Trump was pretty good at hitting upon some of that pain that was going on with many of the people who had served at those two wars. That global financial crisis I was talking about earlier that, you know, led to a lot of bankruptcies in the United States, financial problems of higher deficits and debt, also led to the United States wanting to be less concerned about what happens around the world and having less money to be that global policeman. Again, I go back to Syria, and I remember Barack Obama having those words about there being a red line in Syria. And just kind of keep in mind in that towards the end of, Barack Obama was essentially elected in 2008 because of his opposition to the war in Iraq, and by 2008 the war in Iraq was less popular. And so he kind of was elected to remove the United States from wars. Ultimately ends up escalating in Afghanistan based on the advice of generals. But as the Middle East and ISIS became more of a threat and problem in the region, destabilizing the region, the United States didn't really get involved. And even though they said they would if there was chemical weapons used. So it's like you have this red line, and then you don't really stand behind it. And then, you know, Putin gets involved, and when I say involved, I'm trying to like belittle what they did, but taking over parts of Ukraine in 2014 and meddling, and then trying to get controversial here, but according to the CIA and all the intelligence agencies, Russia meddled in the 2016 election. There was really no consequences for that. And so, again, that kind of idea, and you're like, wait a minute, are there any really boundaries? Like if Russia invades Ukraine, or if Syria kills tens of thousands of its own people, are there really any consequences to this? Is that global policeman going to be involved? I think the answer was no. So those are just some of the things that come to mind of showing that. And then just globally, it's pretty clear that many leaders see putting their nation first, including Trump, and helping other people in other parts of the world is less important to them. And so there seems to be, even from the American people, more of a mandate to say, well, let's focus on what happens here first and not as much over there. So I think that's led to a retreat too. I would think Trump has seen it as part of his mandate to retreat, maybe from NATO, maybe from the United Nations, at least certain agencies within the United Nations. Does that make sense? And I say that like these are just my own views, and you know, it's not to say that they're the right ones, but yeah.
How likely are we to see a continued instability in Europe after power back in the United
Yeah.
the war in Russia and Ukraine is looking like. You know, as far as like, are we going to see more conflict besides Russia and Ukraine between other European nations that's creating instability?
Yeah. Yeah. I have real concerns about that. So the question, just so we all heard it, is, you know, the power vacuum in the European Union, the possibility of increased conflict in that region. Again, we're all Noah has a crystal ball here, but I think that there's going to be pressure on NATO states, Germany in particular, to increase their defense spending. I think Trump's going to put a lot of pressure on those European states to do so. I think there's a real possibility the United States backs out of NATO, either formally or informally. But formally would be we're just no longer going to be part of the NATO. Informally, it could be, well, you know, I can't remember the direct quote that Trump had, but it was something like, well, Putin, you can do whatever you want to Europe if they don't. Do you remember that quote that I'm referring to? And I could, you know, look it up, but it could be where there's supposed to be an attack against one is an attack against all, right? And the only time that that's really been in place is when the United States was attacked at 9/11. Places like all throughout Europe sent troops to Afghanistan, some of which, this is interesting, that Denmark lost per capita more people of their soldiers than the United States did with U.S. soldiers in places like Afghanistan. But now they're like, Trump is talking about taking Greenland, and you know, so there's kind of like, hey, what did we do so wrong here? We helped you, and so I'm just trying to say, like, the only time that the what is it, Article 5? Help me out here. Article 8. Article 5 is, yeah, attack against one is attack against all. And the only time that's really been implemented was after 9/11. But if Russia were to, and I'm just hypothetical here, but you know, invade part of Poland or use a couple missiles in Poland, would the United States defend? Or maybe it's Latvia. Maybe it's, you know, maybe Poland's not the best example, but I don't think it's unreasonable or unlikely that maybe the United States wouldn't really support whatever individual state that is. So I think there's real concerns there for there to be the potential for more violence in the continent of Europe. It's a good question. I wish I had more certainty there. But you know, this was it's hard for me to do an event like this 1 week into the semester, so I don't feel as prepared as I'd like to be. But I thought about doing this last January, in part because what was happening in Gaza, and to try to see is like, this is an awful, awful situation that is happening in Gaza. It's an awful situation that's happening in Ukraine. But what many of us don't, you know, it's also awful what's happening in Sudan, or what was happening in Ethiopia in 2000. Like, there is a lot of violence around the world, and I don't think we are fully comprehending the scale and how this is different than decades before. Despite there being, of course, more precise munitions and technology and ability to target individuals instead of just targeting the general public. So I have the reason I'm having this event is I think that we're in a really unstable situation. I think there's some benefits of having a changing multipolar system, that the United States is only 5% of the world's population. That there should be more the United Nations should be reformed. It was made after World War II with only the certain major powers having permanent membership. A lot of states like Japan or Germany or Brazil, you know, don't have that same permanent status. India, the list goes on and on. But I have real concerns about what this environment might be in 2026, 2027. So, yeah, good question. Other questions? Reactions, implications, things that you think how it might impact states, how it might impact you? Yeah.
That like America's gonna
Yeah. So it's a good question. So just to repeat the question. So if the mantra is America first, is that really going to be applied to all situations around the world, including aid to Israel, which, if you don't know, is one of the biggest recipients of U.S. foreign aid and military aid in the world. And my guess is that America first is going to be applied selectively, and I would be very surprised to see aid to Israel be cut under the Trump administration, or maybe even any administration. So I don't think it's going to be America first and retreat in all areas. I think there's going to be some selectivity to that. One of the things that I am wondering about is, when I mentioned the West Bank earlier, is already, I think, what was it, yesterday, Trump had ended sanctions that were applied under the Biden administration to settlers in the West Bank who were engaged in violence, and those sanctions were removed. And I have real concerns that Netanyahu or Israel could annex the West Bank, and that in the short term, it's great improvement from maybe where things were a few weeks ago, a few months ago, in terms of the prospects of peace. But I wonder where things will be in months and years to come during this administration. So just, again, something to keep your eye on in terms of U.S. leadership and the role that the United States has in the region. And of course, Syria, too, is another X factor of, like, a lot of migrants from Syria to places like Turkey and other parts of the region. Do they come back? Do they, how does that situation play out? Great questions. Any others? Yeah.
It's a little extreme, but could the China and Taiwan situation, China indeed invades Taiwan, could that potentially start a war on a global scale?
Yeah, it certainly could. So the question is, if China were to invade Taiwan, or violence erupts between Taiwan and China, could it turn global? And under the Biden administration, he basically had said, I think, 4 different times that the U.S. would defend Taiwan, an ally, a democracy, but also a place that has, don't quote me on this, but something like 70% of the chips that are made for computers and phones and all kinds of other things. Very key link to the global economy. It is possible, and it's like some of the articles that I was highlighting earlier, that if we get into spheres of influence where maybe there's some, okay, you let us have the Panama Canal and let us do what we want, I don't know, Greenland, and we're going to let you do what you want with Taiwan, and we're going to let Russia do what they want to do in Ukraine. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but that's one of the scenarios. And so maybe for the great powers, this is a better world for them. But for the middle to smaller powers, this could be a real bad situation for them in terms of their sovereignty, in terms of the security of their people. So, yeah, I think, again, our class will watch a PBS Frontline documentary on this, but, some have said by 2027, anywhere between 2025 to 2027, like, China's preparing. They're not quite ready yet, but I think ultimately Taiwan is what they see as theirs. And
Will the U.S. be hit economically?
yeah, the implications of that kind of a war would be global. So even if it was just Taiwan and China and the United States didn't get involved in any way, I mean, again, 70% of a lot of exports from Taiwan are key to the global economy and technology. I think the ramifications, part of the reason I was going to have this event last year, and this is off the top of my head, but if you remember, there was a lot of ships being targeted was it Houthis in Yemen, and people were upset about the higher costs of gas and prices of goods. I'm not trying to minimize this, but like just a few of those missiles, and just imagine the way that this could percolate out through the global economy. It could be really, really, really disastrous. And that's not to minimize like the loss of human life, which would also be catastrophic. And it's not meant to be a downer on a Tuesday here. The idea of this event, though, is to when you're looking at global events, you could look at it just as a leader who's in charge and why. Oh, it's Netanyahu, it's Trump, it's Xi, or whoever the leader is. But this global system. And I'll end by saying this: in international relations, realists, one of the three theories of international relations, they tend to look at the international system as like billiard balls. Imagine a pool table, and all the balls are what you would call individual states. And they're like, those individual states don't matter. Certainly not the leaders of any of these individual states. What matters is the playing field, the system that they're operating in. That is the level of analysis that is most influential. And it'll explain the behavior of those individual states because of that playing field. And what I'm trying to say is that playing field is very topsy-turvy right now. And so it's going to have an impact on all those individual states. And those leaders are going to be navigating a very topsy-turvy world. So appreciate all your questions and comments. For my class, that's it. And on Thursday, I'll see you in the computer lab. Thank you for listening. All right. Take care.